Welcome to another Alaska Quarterly Review Literary Hour. It is so inspiring to hear Alaska Quarterly Review contributors read their work and chat a bit. You can find recordings of previous programs at our website, aqreview.org, and our YouTube channel. I'm Heather Lendy, and on behalf of the Center for Narrative and Lyric Arts and our host, the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center, thank you for being here today. Gunesh Chish, as we say where I am on the banks of the Chilkat River in Haines, Alaska, or Deschutes, as the Tlingit people who have lived here since time immemorial say. It's a peaceful day here, and that suddenly seems such a blessing with the horrible news from Ukraine. I wanted to share this with you from LitHub today before we begin. I just heard 3 explosions, the poet Aya Kiva posted to her Facebook feed the night of February 23rd, 2022. That's just 2022, that's just 2 days ago. Wait, she said, it's still going. Kiva, a poet, translator, and journalist, has lived in Kyiv since the summer of 2014, when she fled her native Donetsk following the outbreak of the war against Russian-backed separatists. For 8 years, Kiva has been one of several young poets in the Ukraine to describe the simultaneous hopelessness of war and hope in a country seeking an independent identity. And I thought today we'd read one of her poems to begin. And when it came my turn to be killed, everyone started to speak Lithuanian. Everyone started to call me Janukas. Someone summoned me hither to their native land. My God, I said, I'm not Lithuanian. My God, I told them. I said it in Russian. My God, I said to them in Ukrainian. There where the Kolumus flows into the Niemen, a child is crying in a church. My God, I said to them in Ukrainian, there where the Kalamus flows into the Newman, a child is crying in church. And now I'd just like to introduce Ron Spatz, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, a professor of English at the University of Alaska. Ron is a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow and the recipient of 2 Alaska Governor's Awards and a contribution to Literacy Award from the Alaska Center for the Book. Under Ron's 4+ decades of leadership and vision, Alaska Quarterly Review has created strong connections between our state and the larger literary community, and has also been influential in supporting new and emerging writers, as well as presenting works that include a rigorous questioning of larger societal issues. Ron?
Thank you so much, Heather, and welcome everyone. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. So that's youtube.com/Alaska Quarterly Review. Please feel free to watch any of our programs and to share them. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to presenting these programs without charge and to showcase vibrant and diverse new and emerging voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. And on this, a day where things that we wouldn't imagine are happening in Ukraine, I can say that Alaska Quarterly, back in the day, probably nearly 40 years ago, we published some poems that were smuggled out of Poland during the Solidarity movement in one of our early issues. So we've never been afraid to actually take on important issues and put some light on them. So before we begin, I'd like to make a few important announcements or acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of the land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples and marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. And now to begin, our Alaska State Writer Laureate, Heather Lindy, will introduce today's writers, Renee Branum, Charlie Buck, and Pete Duval. Heather is the author of 4 books of nonfiction, all published by Algonquin. If You Lived Here, I'd Know Your Name, Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs, Find the Good, and most recently, Of Bears and Ballads. Back to you, Heather.
Thanks, Ron. Sorry, I got kind of emotional about all that, and then you'll have to excuse me. I had to take my dogs downstairs. Anyway, it is really my pleasure to introduce our guests today, and again, thank them for their generosity of time and spirit. Renee Brownham's stories and essays have also appeared, in addition to Alaska Quarterly Review, the Georgia Review, Narrative Magazine, the Gettysburg Review, and Lit Hub. Her story, As the Sparks Fly Upward, was included in the Best American Nonrequired Readings 2019 anthology. She earned an MFA in fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop and nonfiction from the University of Montana. She was recently awarded a National Endowment for the Arts 2020 Prose Fellowship to aid in the completion of her first novel, Defenestration, which was just published by Bloomsbury in January. Congratulations. It's been widely praised, including by one of this series' contributors, Dina Neri, who says, Branham's prose lights up the imagination. Every line is a discovery and a pleasure. Beyond simple elegance or precision, she weaves sense and simile so stunningly that you have to throw up your hands and say, damn. Neri says she is thrilled by the beauty and the insight of Branham's new book. Pete Duval's short story collection, The Deposition, winner of the 2020 Juniper Prize for Fiction, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press in March 2021. An earlier collection, Rear View, published by Houghton Mifflin, won the Breadloaf Writers Conference Bakeless Prize and the Connecticut Book Award, and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. In addition to AQR, his fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Ascent, the Massachusetts Review, and Witness, among other venues. He grew up in coastal Massachusetts and has worked as a lawnmower in his hometown cemetery. He's currently a professor at West Chester and Spalding universities. Pete Duval, who says, I'm a photographer, not a professional, but definitely obsessional. I go out every day with my camera. It's refreshing to work in a thoroughly nonverbal medium. It's almost like a spiritual practice. It reduces me to the act of seeing. He says for him as a writer and as someone interested in unmediated encounters with incarnational reality, it has taught him to appreciate and understand light. And he says that way of seeing has absolutely no downside. And Charlie Buck is an American poet and writer. Her writing has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Nevada Arts Council, and her artwork has received awards from the Mid-Atlantic National Endowment for the Arts and the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts. She's received multiple residencies at MacDowell. Her stories have appeared in publications including Story Magazine and The New Yorker. She also works as an ethnographer for the Southwest Folklife Alliance and the End of Care Partnership in Tucson, and has served residencies as an artist in the schools for the University of Arizona's Poetry Center. Charlie Buck, who says, during residencies, I sometimes invite an artist to share their work with my students. While working with the rap music and break dancing obsessed 5th grade classroom in Ochoa Elementary, I serendipitously met rapper Todd the Creator when he repaired my air conditioner. His performance presentation left students electrified. Suddenly they saw their poems as potential raps and raps as poetry. A lot of energized writing resulted. And I think, I'm trying to remember who's going first here. I think it's Charlie, is that correct?
That's right.
That's right. So Charlie, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for that introduction. The The story that I'm reading, well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I was turned on to Alaska Quarterly Review a long time ago when Grace Paley was publishing in your magazine. And I'm so grateful for her nonfiction that was published there and that very rarely saw the light of day other places. So we know her fiction, but we should all be reading her nonfiction too. This story is called Preparedness, and it takes place in 2002, shortly after our invasion of Afghanistan. Did all newborns look like hillbillies? The baby's beady eyes and startling gums. It was like seeing a snake grin or glimpsing the gills of a fish in the mouth of a human. So unsettling. As was the fact that the baby never smiled at her, the most recent in a long line of people who hadn't found her funny. The first had been her parents. It was still an echo in her head, how one or the other would say, "Do you think that's funny?" in a way that made clear they did not. The baby lay on a dishcloth on the kitchen table while the dad finished wiping its creases. Its skin was loose, as though it had gone on a radical diet while still in her womb. She was born with size large skin and a size small body, the dad said with affection. But what the mother felt was closer to dismay. This little yellow baby, who even when naked, still seemed to be wearing some old man's wrinkled pants. "She's such a nice baby. It's too bad we're going to have to return her," she said, and her husband laughed, a short, startled bark. He found her funny. After only a few dates, he told her that even if he didn't laugh at the time, that later he often thought of things she said and laughed then. She hoped he was off laughing by himself a lot lately, since he sure wasn't doing it around her. A headline on top of the paper stacked beside the baby caught her eyes. 36 comedians killed in the war. She was aghast. "They're sending comedians now?" He looked at her neutrally. "Let me see that." She pointed out the story. Canadians. She was that kind of tired, the kind that bent words and emotions into unrecognizable forms. Her husband laid the baby on its cocktail napkin-sized diaper. He folded the tabs over, frowned, then pulled them open again and rotated the diaper under the baby. She was supposed to figure this out all by herself after he was gone. His National Guard unit had recently been activated. When they got the news, he'd insisted they move from the city to this safe, distant, barely affordable suburb. It might as well be the moon. None of her friends would venture this far from the city to visit. And the one time she descended into the metro system with the baby, she'd become nauseous. It felt wrong to take a baby underground, no matter how well lit. "Just remind me," she said, "what's so great about being in the Guard? Because I'm having a hard time remembering." In all fairness, the father had signed up long before he'd met her, back when the Guard was more of a national janitorial service, cleaning up after disasters and floods and things like that. But they'd always worn uniforms and carried guns. And wasn't that reason enough never to have volunteered? "The cross-section of people I've gotten to know. I'd never met them in my regular day-to-day life." "What do you think reality TV is for?" she said, and the baby startled, wailing. Volunteering was one thing. What she couldn't understand was why, now that there was a wife and a war and a baby, he hadn't unvolunteered. Why wouldn't he abandon his country when it was acting like a nutcase? Though that this trait was currently working in her favor had occurred to her. "You're going to sour your milk," her husband said, his voice straddling the line between exasperated and amused. "Don't mention milk," she cautioned, too late. Heat surged into her breasts. She looked down in disbelief as two dark circles expanded like time-lapse photos across the front of her cowboy shirt. She popped open the snaps and unhooked a soaked bra cup. He handed her the baby and she turned it to her breast. Its tongue fluted around her nipple, forming a mollusk-like seal as it nursed. He stood above her, his gaze lingering on her chest. "You liked my breasts. I didn't like your breasts. I loved them. I loved your breasts." "This is too past tense for me." Just remember, he said to the nursing baby, I have a remainder interest. Her breasts were perfect, except that he couldn't touch them. At night, if she even heard his hand rasp across the sheets, her nipples began to weep milk. The nursing bra didn't help, even though essentially it was a peekaboo bra with cups that peeled down. But instead of having the louche allure of crotchless panties, it looked more like bandages from the Eastern Bloc. They'll be back, she said, but neither of them believed it. And in the meantime, we've got all this. She awkwardly proffered the breast the baby wasn't nursing on, a breast that very possibly outweighed the baby. Nice, he said, in a way she found momentarily cheering, then demoralizing. Nice? The baby reeled away from her, staring at the ceiling in a glazed, ecstatic state. The father slipped his hand under the little back and cupped the baby against his chest as she tucked and snapped herself back in. Do you love her? She asked. Sometimes. I guess I feel more like a technician than a dad. Like I should be wearing a lab coat and latex gloves when I handle her. He looked down at the baby. But I do feel something right here, he said, patting his lower stomach, when I look at her. He touched the baby's hand and 3 tiny fingers wrapped around one of his. Huh, she said. She wasn't feeling it. She'd spent her adulthood thinking of love as something that required lingerie and elusiveness, not nursing bras and unvarying availability. Was this love? She leaned to blow warm air over the baby's fuzzy head, and it shut its eyes. I can tell from the way she looks at me that she doesn't like me, she said. All you are to her now is milk, and she likes that plenty. When she was inside me, we were closer. She remembered all the swirls and gurgles she'd interpreted as good humor. He said they should put a warning on all new babies. Your fear reflected here. Yeah, it should be woven into those blue stripes on swaddling blankets at the hospital, she agreed, her voice thickening. What a kindness that would be, he murmured, rubbing the index finger of his free hand across her forehead, trying to smooth it. Now I'm jumping ahead in the story. The husband's been deployed. As you might guess from the beginning of the story, she's not adjusting well. And the baby's about 7 months old now. An ache in her bones. She didn't know if it was grief or exhaustion or depression or leukemia. Maybe it was caused by reading the paper. She no longer cooked or cleaned. She fed the baby, ate energy bars, and read the paper. She read old newspapers and new ones compulsively, without pleasure or recall. She kept reading as the baby nursed, till they both dropped off. She didn't want to read about war, but it was strewn across the sheets. Today, when they woke up, it was even transferred to the baby's sweaty skin. She put the baby in the sink and washed her, gray-tinged water gurgling down the drain. Better go to the park. Her husband was in Afghanistan. She could brave the park. Park, she asked, and a shine immediately seemed to hit the baby. It turned to where the snuggling hung on the back of the door and said, Bah! Yeah, she said, humbug, but we'll try it. As they walked down the hill to the park, she pointed out various signs. Stop sign, school bus, squirrel, McMansion. It was only as she caught sight of the playground and forced a wave at the clot of moms who truly seemed not to see her that her spirits plunged. Was it a reflection of the times, these tightened ranks of mothers? Did a new mom pose a security risk? She sat alone at one picnic table while the chattering moms clustered at the other. The baby writhed in the carrier, and she unfastened one side and slid her onto the edge of the table. The baby's impatient, intelligent eyes raked the trees, the dogs, the play structures before settling on the children. But she pulled the baby to her, but with a cry, it twisted back to the children. Oh, Bot, she said. She picked the baby up and carried her over to the sandbox, where 2 skinny blonde kids in dirty frocks glanced up at them. The baby kicked her fat legs and squealed. Both girls had the kind of fine hair that seemed to float rather than hang. The taller one said, "Do you remember when I was 3 and my hair was still curly? And I was yelling for mom to let me in and she said no." "I wasn't born yet," said the smaller one. "Well, I don't think she heard me," said the taller girl. Then both girls looked up at her expectantly, as if she were going to provide some magic. "Why are you staring at us?" the younger one asked. "You have such interesting socks," she said, tilting the baby to see them. The smaller girl's socks were different colors and heights. "When my socks turn out like this, I pretend the tall one is the big sister and the short one is the little sister," the girl said, tugging up the shorter sock. "Oh, that's great," she said. She stood holding the baby, but then thought she might be making them uncomfortable. As she turned to leave, the big sister said, "Hey, do you want to play Pocahontas with us?" Warmth prickled up her arms and over her scalp. She glanced over at the moms. They were oblivious to her, and suddenly that seemed like a good thing. She felt she was probably committing some sort of generational faux pas, but she squatted on her heels anyway, the baby cooing up at the blondes. "How do you play?" "Well, I'm Pocahontas, and my sister is Captain John Smith. You could be the bad guy." It was so nice to be included. She felt the thrill of potential friends, even though there were maybe 6 and 4. "Can my baby play?" The older girl studied the baby dubiously, but the smaller one said, "Sure, he can be the bad guy's fat little dog." "Okay," she said, delighted, and the girls flashed quick smiles. "What do we do?" "You just act like the person you are," the big sister said, "like this." Turning to her sister, she trilled, "Captain John Smith, I just love your new tie-dyed dress." Captain John Smith grabbed the hem of her dappled skirt and sashayed along the edge of the sandbox. Her fat little dog squirmed in her lap, and she felt a wrench inside her chest. Just act like the person you are. Pocahontas bent over the baby, her wisps of hair tickling the baby's face, and the mother made little growls and yaps as she leaned her baby forward. A squeal pealed from the baby, and she craned her neck to look back at her mom, a gleaming bolt of eye contact, a fat chuckle, like this. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was, I want to read the in-between part now, but thank you very much. And now Peter is next.
Okay. It's great to be reading for AQR. It's a magazine I've always loved and respected. Thanks for having me. I'm going to read a story called Common Area. It has an epigraph by Robert Stone from A Flag for Sunrise. He felt as though he were choosing one dream from among many. There were birds in all of them. The air traffic controller had always admired St. Francis of Assisi's uncomplicated rapport with small birds and animals. On the walk back from the bar, he decided to visit the parrots. These self-possessed birds held their tongues by night and woke at dawn to startle guests at the bed and breakfast with garbled approximations of unremarkable daily sounds. Now, in the parlor upstairs, he lifted the cover from one of the hulking cages. It was an Afghan with radial powder blue piping that he suspected the owner herself had knitted. He liked the owner. She wore clothes intended for a much younger woman. He admired that. She served breakfasts of tarts and a variety of overly sweet things, then followed these up with dessert. She looked fit in jeans. The parrot beneath raised its head groggily. This would be Rita. The owner had told them the night before that her son was the only other person alive who could touch this bird. For years, they'd had a special relationship, her son and Rita. The air traffic controller had flashed to images of St. Francis of Assisi, thin-faced, one bony hand extended to the sparrows, stigma clearly visible. Cage cover in hand, he became aware of his own swaying. churned by the waves of what was possible. Lodging at the bed and breakfast was his wife's idea. He left that kind of thinking to her. It beat Hampton in, but he resented the forced conversation with other guests in the morning, and he avoided the common area. The walls were thin. The first night, lying in the narrow bed next to his wife, he'd worried about the owner's son. He'd heard the floorboards outside the room snap, then fall silent. And he imagined he could feel the feathery edge of the man's zone of influence through the wall. This made him nervous about performing the connubial intimacies incumbent upon all married men. The owner's son drank, that was clear. He'd emerged from half-darkened rooms wearing a soiled t-shirt. Perhaps this is a man of inconsistent moral convictions. The air traffic controller lifted the latch to open the cage and slid the sleeve of his jacket up past his elbow. According to the owner, parrots like these routinely lived beyond 100 years. Rita was the younger bird with a long life ahead of her. The air traffic controller was already 51. He ate 30-minute steel-cut oatmeal in the morning and exercised aerobically. He had that kind of patience. Into the cage went his fist, slowly. He was trespassing. Well within his zone of concern now, Rita fidgeted. They demonstrated wisdom, these birds. People wrote them into their wills. During the day, Rita imitated a landline telephone and the end of recess bell from the grammar school next door. She issued what sounded like spoken English words. The air traffic controller knew better. What made a word wasn't only the sound. The night before, the owner had warned him not to insert his finger into the cage. Rita's beak appeared to be made of calcium, formed through a process of accretion, like the curve of a nautilus shell. Last night, the air traffic controller had stood in this same spot, bourbon fuzzy, and all at once he'd realized the owner didn't trust him. Her words, her glances, her whole manner seemed to call into existence a world of recrimination to swallow him whole. She was a tiny woman with a handsome face and clear eyes, sassy eyes. With them, she'd seen something in the air traffic controller, some flaw in his soul that might lead to cruelty. But the air traffic controller wasn't cruel. He was competent. He kept thousands of people airborne and alive. Rita understood. They had their own connection. The air traffic controller commuted 45 minutes each way to work, rode the elevator to the 11th floor of a building with small windows in suburban Tampa, not far from a decommissioned section of the Air Force Base. Between shifts, he read widely: science, meteorology, military history. He absorbed language courses on various digital media. Noons, he lunched at Subway with men his age who piloted remote-operated drones into enemy airspace on the other side of the planet. He'd played squash with one of them, only to decide against allowing the friendship to blossom after imagining the man's interior life. The air traffic controller's own zone of operation, the airspace he officially presided over, started small at ground level. There it stretched just 50 miles across, but ascended in expanding radii to form an inverted wedding cake. He used this analogy at breakfast across from other husbands whom he secretly pitied for their positions as postal clerks or sales associates or small business owners, and his wife rolled her eyes. "Rita," he said, "what's the word on the street?" In slow motion, the bird shifted her prehistoric grip along a wooden dowel, edging away from him. She cocked her head. She was dripping with character. When the air traffic controller started to bob in place, Rita bobbed as well. "Get down," he whispered. "Show me what you got." Farther into the cage, he piloted his fist. She stopped bobbing and issued a low-pitched rumbling noise akin to human gargling. Whoa. Shoulders hunched, he listened for stirrings in the house. Nothing. Rita leaned forward, then crept back, teasing him. He slipped his cell phone from his jeans. The night before, he'd been videotaping Rita through the bars of her cage when the owner appeared. Even at work, he had a lot of time on his hands in between brief shifts. He managed a huge portion of Caribbean airspace. Millions benefited, people he could only envision in dreams, each at the center of a circle, the overlapping edges bluish green. He called up the video of Rita and faced the phone toward her like a mirror she might peer into. Perched at the threshold of the cage, she need only lean forward to stroke the smooth surface of the phone with her calcified carapace of a beak. She seemed bored. The video ended. The air traffic controller wiped the phone on his jeans and put it away and offered Rita his wrist. "It's your call," he said. She angled an eye at him, at his wrist, then inched onto the bump of it, her talons needling his skin. "I'm not cruel, Rita," he said. "I'm patient." Rita seemed to understand. He focused. He tried to sensitize himself to her zone, which he imagined extending a few inches from the center of her being, where whatever it was that looked out through her eyes resided. From there, if it existed, it would radiate out beyond her downy outline into the realm of worldly contingencies. But he saw nothing like that. Rita lowered her iridescent head as though inviting him to caress the soft blue-green region above her beak, like a lover. But he was cautious. The owner had done exactly this the night before, even as she'd issued warnings. And when he tried it now, Rita bobbed left, then right, a slow motion dodge, like something from the age of silent film. Years from now, this bird, this very Rita, would remember the air traffic controller. He'd be dead. All the people he'd kept safe would be dead, not Rita. He offered up the bony fulcrum of his knuckle against which she might scratch herself. He wasn't going to rush her. She could come to him. But she must have grown confused despite her limitless wisdom, because she raised her beak in a swift, thoroughly natural motion, clamped onto the fatty bulge below his knuckle and opened a beak-shaped gash. She hopped to the room's only wingback chair to look back at him. He whistled an insuck, cupped his hand, and turned toward the hallway light. "Damn, girlfriend." There was a triangular flap, a little trap door of flesh and pulp, like the incurled isosceles he'd punched into cans of high C as a child. There was no pain yet. The blood welled thick and viscous, spilling into his other palm, then over to drip and bead on the oriental rug's elaborate patterns. At first, he had the presence of mind not to move. He resisted the airy panic of two eager pourers of champagne, surprised by the volume of bubbly. He took his finger in his mouth and tongued the wound. It tasted the way licking the nodes of a 9-volt battery felt, tangy. Rita's entire manner suggested a profound lack of concern. Her own dry tongue appeared for a moment. With it, she seemed to lick her lips. But parrots didn't have lips. They had beaks. Hers was limned with red. Stiffly, the air traffic controller stepped into the lavatory off the parlor and with his elbow tripped the light switch. He stood over an antique porcelain sink all spidered with brownish cracks and watched it spot with red. With the meat of his good hand, he twisted the cold water on and let the clean stream rinse the blood from his finger in curled strings. He pulled a hand towel from a silver loop and fashioned a bandage that wound around and around to end in a fat cotton mitt that he held up for inspection. He felt calm, but this didn't surprise him. Whatever his own circle touched, even for a moment, it left calmer, more itself. In the parlor, Rita clung to the converging bars at the crown of her cage. She scratched her head with a free claw. She lifted a wing to dislodge parasites with her enormous beak. The air traffic controller listened again for stirring in the house. He unraveled the bandage, and the gore surged like fresh jewelry. He found a clean towel and tightly rewrapped the wounded finger. "I see what you mean, Rita," he said to himself. "I hear you." Back in the parlor, he watched the bird maneuver with the steadying grip of her beak into the cage. What did the taste of human flesh do to a parrot? Enough said. He snapped the door shut, lifted the cage from its hook, set it on the rug to drape the knit cover. With his good hand, his boots avoiding the blood splatter on the rug, he carried the cage out into the hallway's polished hardwood, down the stairs, then into the wider space of what the owner called the common area. The wound in his fingers seemed fully awake now. He could feel the It seemed to be transmitting in a code he'd forgotten along telegraph wires that loped to the farthest outposts of what he was. Near the threshold to the den, he felt a ripple, a fluctuation he associated with the intersection of zones. Then he saw, slumped on a couch, the owner's son, whose overcoat had ridden up to his waist, his chin resting in a pool of his own neck flesh. "Which one you got there, champ?" A puffy man. He didn't take up a lot of space. He was younger than the air traffic controller by 15 years. They looked like contemporaries. The air traffic controller raised the cage and cleared his voice. "Rita, I think." "You mean Kiwi?" The owner's son sat up. "No, it's Rita. I don't know where you came up with Rita. There's Kiwi and Wink." He reached for a square, unlabeled bottle at a side table, his wet eyes on the air traffic controller. He drew a slow, significant draft. "She nip you?" The air traffic controller lifted the mid of his fist. "Sweet Jesus." The owner's son stood, approached, slowed, smiled. "Did you stop up on the way home?" There was mockery in his voice. "We haven't been formally introduced. Where are you taking my bird?" The man seemed to remember the bottle in his hand. He offered it up to the air traffic controller, whose own hands were full. Then he crouched carefully to lift the cover. "You got Kiwi here. She's not partial to this cover. Too hot. Not enough air gets in. She don't like it." "That's your bird." The air traffic controller tried to smile. "They're both my birds, our birds, me and my mother's. You have something with Rita, a certain special something between you. Let's get some air." A rapport. He thought he could see it now, the uneven frontier of the man's zone, shifting, glimmering. The owner's son stood blinking at him. "Put the cage down." "I wouldn't hurt Rita." "It's Kiwi. Put the cage down." The air traffic controller glanced at his bandaged hand, thinking he might see his wounded finger charged and burning through the fabric of the towel, its own species of light leaking out. "I apologize. I left a little blood on the rug up there." "Up where?" "In the parlor, on the rug." "You've had a few. You stopped off." Neither of them had noticed the owner. Now it was too late. She stood in the hall in a tartan robe, her hair up, her arms crossed, her thin white shins below. "Oop," said the son. She looked from one man to the other and back. "What I tell you," she said finally to the air traffic controller. There was power in her eyes. "You stuck your finger in the cage." Not the whole story, but the air traffic controller wasn't going to get into it all. A complicated world. "I did," he said. "How bad she get you?" she asked. A granny and a looker all in one. A seer into his uncluttered soul. Then, "Where are you taking my bird?" The owner's son fussed with a boxy lump in his t-shirt pocket. Him and I were going out for a smoke. But the owner continued to glare at the air traffic controller, even after he'd set the cage down between them. Her eyes were unbearable. People were dying on the other side of the world, he wanted to say, flickering out, failing. Here we were bickering over birds in Florida. So be it, he wanted to say, lesson learned. He'd never touch another parrot in his life. Decades hence, in homes not yet built by people not yet born, Rita would grow strong on the memory of his blood. He'd live on in that way. The owner stepped forward. The air traffic controller edged back, as though to stay just outside her zone of significance. But her zone of significance was as undeniable as it was vast, and by now he knew its edges extended well beyond the X-ray frame of the great house. Thank you.
Wow, that was something. Thank you. I'm not sure I want a parrot now. I always say.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Just before we started the show today, we were talking, and I don't know why parrots came. I was like, oh my gosh, parrots came up, and then you read a story about parrots, and I didn't know this was going to happen, and now I'm thinking, I'm not sure about parrots. At least not, Kiwi, read it, whatever. Anyway, thank you. Thanks, Pete, very much.
Thank you.
Renee, it's your turn.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Heather and Ron, for having me. And thank you, Peter and Charlie, for reading with me. This has been Such a treat. Back when I was at Iowa, I wrote a lot of really long short stories that were like 50 pages. And I had a heck of a time finding a good home for them. And I was so thrilled when I finally found a good home for one of them with Alaska Quarterly Review. And that's always been a very meaningful publication for me, that story in particular. But I'm not going to read that story today. I'm going to read from my new novel, Defenestrate, which is 1 month old today. Today's its 1 month birthday of being in the world. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning so I don't have to do too much setting up. But I do want to note for listeners that the novel is written in short titled sections. And I'll be reading 4 of those sections. So I'll just read the title and then the vignette that follows. Golden Years. When I picture the city now, I see it from overhead, bird's eye. A long, lonely aerial view looking down onto orange clay roof tiles, curved like the shells of snails. The city shrinks, small enough to be covered with a palm. My palm, my twin brother's. We both seem to remember those years from above, as if we were often sailing out over the streets that opened up into squares, the ice skating rink dusted blue, that high clock tower with its windows sealed shut, the bridge a long spine of black bone straining across the bread-colored water. And I guess it's true that the city rises, tiered, made up of slopes and heights, spires and hilltops and towers, all these high places you could climb to get a better view of things. And I guess it's also true that I was always climbing them. I remember once wandering home drunk and coming upon a bit of scaffolding along the back wall of a church and starting to climb it without even blinking. My brother was there too, but he didn't follow. He stood with his hands shoved into his coat pockets, whistling Golden Years and rocking forward and back on the balls of his feet. Always so careful, my brother. It's strange that eventually he was the one to fall. I stood up there with the frost in the air hitting me just right, so that the skin on my face came awake for a moment, and then my cheeks went all sleepy and numb, and there was a faintly greenish mist coming up off the snow that sat in gutters, tram lights glancing upward. Nick waited down below until finally he called up, "Hey sis, you get your kicks yet?" And I guess I had. I don't know what it was I hoped to see from up there. The street getting smaller as though I was looking at it through the wrong end of a telescope, the spires at the base of the hill poking holes in the tame rounded skyline. I was always daring just a little too much in those days, putting space between myself and the ground, myself and safety, myself and my cautious, slope-shouldered brother who was singing under his breath, "Don't let me hear you say life's taking you nowhere, angel. Come get up, my baby." The whole time I was climbing dizzily back down to him. The curse. There's a superstition in our family about falling, a kind of tight-lipped joke that's no longer a joke because it's happened too often over the years. Cousins leaning against railings that wouldn't hold their weight, uncles losing their footing while cleaning leaf debris from slimy gutters, aunts toppling from ladders, their spines folding up on themselves like coat hangers. Something in our bodies wants to fall, blood magnetized to pavement, iron and concrete greeting each other across a stretch of air, the downward plunge and crack, like a pink Easter egg dropped from a window. We splinter that easily. We can trace it back a century or so, the story of our great-great-grandfather Jerzy in Prague, who was said to give a gentle push to the back of a Roma stonemason where he stood placing chunks of limestone, smooth and flush, to form the bottom sill of a paneless window in a high church steeple. It was 1895, and there was a resurgence of new architecture, renovation, the city preening and polishing itself, like a vast peacock with slate and granite and sandstone feathers. Jiří oversaw many of these building projects, gained a reputation for precision and efficiency. The stonemason, it was said, had seduced Jiří's youngest daughter, but who knew anymore if this was true? What was certain was that the stonemason landed below on rain-slick cobblestones, and his body bent into a hook, curving strangely like a treble clef. And according to legend, witnesses afterward reported that the body didn't bleed. No, they said, not even a trickle. I couldn't tell you what Jiří felt looking down at the question mark the stonemason's bloodless body made against the wet cobbles, the slice of October light that fell across him like a sash, whether our ancestor felt triumph or shame or a rage that still itched in his palms after the suddenness of the shove. But I can tell you that it was the end for him of his hard-won reputation, the end of a long and respectable career, and he fled with his wife and children to the American Midwest, where he found work as a mule driver in a coal mine. It was there the family stayed, and there my brother and I grew up. The belief is that the stonemason's fall has somehow been handed down through the years, that for generations our family has held on to this death and never been forgiven. You could call it a curse, but that's a word we never seemed to use. It's only a story our mother always told my brother and me, but I remember some nights her superstition would get the better of her, and she'd line the floor around our beds with pillows, tucking the blankets so tight around our little bodies that we struggled and thrashed after she switched off the lights, straining against our cocoons like Houdini escaping from a straitjacket. Someone, some relative perhaps, had given our mother a coffee mug that showed a simple cartoon illustration of a man and woman perched on the edge of a deep swimming pool, peering into it. The pool had been drained of all but a foot of water, and standing in the shallow water down below, the pool's high walls looming around him, was a little boy with a tiny rubber inner tube around his middle. The image's caption read, "Better safe than sorry, son." It was this mug that often rested on the squat nightstand between our twin beds while our mother kissed our foreheads, made the blankets tight around us. A smell came up from the mug like leaves going soft at the bottom of a well, mint, citrus, chamomile, as deep and unfathomable as the earth's molten center. And I remember turning my head on the pillow to stare at the mug, the two parents side by side, their legs dangling into the emptiness of the drained pool, and I remember hating them a little for their stifling caution. I think a part of me always longed for the fall. I know it's morbid, but I remember growing up with a kind of envy for that sweet, endless plummet, how your body can be given a measure of grace as it greets the air, feels its own heft and buoyancy. Some members of the family are so superstitious, they will not go higher than the second floors of buildings, will keep far back from balcony railings or the sharp, sudden edges of hiking trails. But I've always dared more than the others, climbing up onto steeply pitched roofs, looking out at towering views with an arm slung loosely around a chimney, skirting close to ledges, daring my own weight to pull me down, daring a phantom push from behind, and feeling the height lift through me, all the way from feet to forehead. When I was a little girl, I wanted to be a trapeze artist, a stunt pilot, a high dive champion, a female Evel Knievel. Your mother will not go for it, not a chance, my father said when I showed him a flyer for a circus camp when I was 8. Glossy pictures of arched bodies poised on high platforms, lifting their arms above their heads as if straining to get even higher before rising into the air like gaudy smoke, ruby sequins dusting the air with light. It's safe, I protested, showing him pictures of padded mats on the internet, showing him harnesses and cables. A year or so later, I showed my mother an article in National Geographic about cave divers. Now, don't you go getting any ideas, she said, shaking her head a little wildly, her earrings tinkling like tiny bells. She held me and I squirmed in her lap. She sniffed at my hair and I imagined that it smelled like the high branches of elm trees, like sap and sunlight and too much air. We all make our way through a world of so much danger. I could never believe that our fear should be any greater than anyone else's. I didn't want to believe that my body would be asked to pay any consequence for the actions of a relation I'd never met, of whom not even a single photograph exists. Not that I couldn't imagine him. I felt at times that I knew his face, craggy and sunken-eyed, heavily shadowed from the sight of the stonemason stumbling forward into all that air, swallowing gusts of it on the way down. And on the pavement below, his chest swollen with that huge final breath. Defenestrate. One thing the city of Prague is famous for, throwing men out of windows. The word for this is defenestration. Tourists can climb the narrow stairs to the room where Catholic noblemen were defenestrated because of a religious dispute in 1618. You can look down from the window to see exactly the length of their fall. Catholics say these men were saved by angels, cradled in the arms of the Virgin herself, lowered gently to earth. Protestants say the men survived because they landed in a dung heap piled below the window. Looking down from that window, it is easy to imagine an angel in the expanse between sill and cobblestones. Easier still to imagine a pile of shit, and easiest of all to conclude the city holds both of these in the loose clasp of its hand. Specificity. I remember reading a poem about a philosopher getting thrown out a window and thinking on his way to the ground about why the word for what was happening to him, the word defenestration, even existed. There's no special word, he muses, for being bludgeoned by a golf club, for being tossed off a bridge, for getting run over by a train. So why should this act have been given such a specific name? In the end of the poem, he lands, he survives. He concludes that defenestration is not, in fact, limited to people being flung through windows. Its definition is not as narrow as its original inventors first intended. According to the philosopher, the word speaks, rather, to the specificity of all human experience, of each act being private and particular to the individual experiencing it. His own particular experience being, specifically, that he was hurled through an upstairs window and fell and survived. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee. I'm kind of my mother used to say that I was a wealth of useless information, and the defenestration of Prague is like, I remember it from a high school history class. And I went to a Quaker school, so I always thought they landed in the manure pile. But it's nice to know maybe they were angels, you know. And now I always think of it every time you're on an airplane when they say it's time to deplane. I'm like, defenestration, deplane, where do these words come from? Anyway, wonderful. It's nice to have a little conversation now at this part, and we do have a few minutes to do that. And the one thing that came up in my mind with all three of you was that you're all talking about pretty difficult, hard things, but there's like an underlying humor, and I wasn't sure during all of it, is it okay to laugh or not? I mean, Charlie's story, you know, it was funny. Peter's was, Renee's was too, but also tough. And then I was also thinking, you know, just kind of the way my brain works about listening to the news today at lunchtime, and a reporter was talking about being in Ukraine right now, and how she said there was a lot of humor. There were people were making jokes in the subway, and that she was surprised at how that there were people facing this, you know, the worst thing that you could imagine happening with a you know, it's not a cliche, really dark humor. And I'm wondering if you all would like to talk about that a little bit, the line between you know, the worst that can happen and humor, and how that happens. If that's something you'd like to talk about. If not, you could just talk about whatever you want to. I'm sure we'd enjoy hearing you speak among yourselves, but that was something that to me, came through all of the readings today.
No, I think humor is a coping mechanism, and I think in the darkest times, it's something that can steady us and be a strange form of courage, actually, to put experiences that are too huge almost to process in the moment, to put a little distance between yourself and them, and to soften them enough to rise to the occasion of what you really need to be doing. So I really enjoyed the humor in both of your pieces, and yours it was very dry, Pete, and in yours it was sort of droll, Renee. And I like that humor can happen in so many different ways. We sort of say something's funny or it's ironic, but it's really like 800 different things and different responses to different circumstances. And I think the three pieces that we read showed that, and your story about the subway in Ukraine shows it, because it's always with us. It's a release from the moment that enables us to face the moment.
Yeah, I think it allows us to get kind of meta on the moment, right? Like it gives us some ability to kind of stand apart from it. But yeah, I don't think I purposely tried to be funny per se. It's just that I think I have a good sensitivity to just the absurd things in life, just which I think is really helpful for a writer, but just as a human being too, right? Just to be able to kind of like I said, kind of step back from something and kind of see it from a, like you were saying, a distance, slight distance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't always think of myself as a funny writer, but I do love comedy as an art form and as a storytelling device. And my narrator of my novel also loves comedy, and one of the coping mechanisms for her in dealing with her family's legacy is just deeply rooted obsession with Buster Keaton, which I also share with her. And it's funny because she is so serious in her love for Keaton that she doesn't really even think of him as a comedian. She thinks of him as sort of an artist of falling, and is sort of a patron saint of the fall for her. But obviously he worked very hard to get a laugh from his audience. So like that's a huge part of his aesthetic and his perspective as an artist. So yes, that's nice, Heather, that you saw that as a common thread for all of us.
Yeah, and I appreciated it very much. And we're at the end of the hour, and I don't want to keep you any longer because I really appreciate the time that you've shared with us and your generosity in supporting Alaska Quarterly Review and sharing your stories with us today. And I'm looking forward to reading all of Defenestration. And in fact, I'm ordering it from the local bookstore here in Haines, which is, the best way that if you would like to support writers like the ones we heard today, or any writers, you're hearing my cuckoo clock, the best way to do that is to buy their books, and preferably from a local bookstore. Also, another way to do it is to support literary magazines like Alaska Quarterly Review, get a subscription, send us a donation, get a gift subscription for somebody, and that's another way. So thank everybody for joining us today for another event in AQR's 2022 literary series, and on behalf of the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, and all our gratitude, and again for the generosity of today's writers, to Renee and Pete and Charlie, and also to Cody Carver and the Anchorage Museum at the Rasmussen Center who produced this program. And as always, Ron, the last word is yours.
Thank you, Heather. And again, I want to thank Charlie, Pete, and Renee for generously supporting Alaska Quarterly and for gracing our pages with your wonderful work. Very grateful to you. Heather, thank you again for another event. Thank you, Anchorage Museum and Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts. In March, we have two events. 3 poets on March 11th, Jessica Jacobs, Francine Morasti, and John Bargowski. And on March 25th, we have 1 poet, Bruce Bond, and 2 nonfiction writers, Ann Kayer and Mary Kudinoff. So March will be great. And until then, thank you all so much for joining us.
Ron,
Thanks so much.
Ron, before we go, could you remind viewers again about the YouTube channel, in particular, the event that we just had on February 16th that they might want to see?
Sure. We had an amazing event. We're going to have more of those kinds of things. It's in the plans. We had an event called Facts into Poems, a conversation between Jane Hirschfield and Dorianne Locks. It was an hour event and it was phenomenal. I think you guys will love it. And just to give a little background, it started with the idea that both Jane and Dorianne wrote poems that Alaska Quarterly wound up publishing from the same exact newspaper kind of fact that came out about what they had discovered in Pompeii. So with 2 different poetic lenses at 2 different times without consulting with each other. And then we got one of the poems and then have another one coming out. We thought, you know what? There's something about some synchronicity here. We ought to have an event about facts into poems. And so that's exactly what we did. So our YouTube channel has lots of events among, all the different genres, and this will be there too. So this event will be there. So again, thank you for reminding me to say that, Heather.
Okay, well, and thank you all too.